right, welcome to Ryan Research Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Ryan. I am joined today by a fantastic economist, Dr. Jostein Hauge, who's a political economist at the University of Cambridge. He has a fantastic new book out called The Future of the Factory: How Megatrends Are Changing Industrialization, published by Oxford University Press. And it's an exploration of what exactly industrial policy is, how it's been used through history, how it's used around the world, and how it impacts our current discussions on how to engage with economic development today, especially concerning dichotomies between the global north and the global south. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having me here.
Great. So I would love just to turn it over to you to introduce yourself more at length, speak to where you first got inspired by these ideas and how that then fed into the culmination of this book.
Yeah, so my work is at the intersection of international political economy and development economics. And for a long time, I've had an interest in industrialization processes. So understanding the role of industrialization in the role of economic development, in the role of how countries build economic prosperity over time. And in recent years, a lot of things have been happening in the global economy that should make us perhaps rethink how industrialization happens, how countries build up productive capabilities, and so on. So this book is really about looking at global shifts in the world economy and how, if and how they should make us rethink how countries build up economic prosperity through manufacturing.
And why is manufacturing so important?
Yeah, so we can go back a long time to answer this question. It started becoming, or people started seeing it becoming very important at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, people have manufactured things before the Industrial Revolution. So I'm here referring to the British Industrial Revolution in around the 1700s. But obviously, people have been manufacturing things before then using tools. But during the Industrial Revolution, starting in Great Britain, this was the first time we saw the mechanization of production, the use of machines, and the rise of the factory system. Now, what happened because of this? Well, we saw that things could be produced at a much faster scale. We saw technology advancing at a much faster scale. And in Great Britain, in the first instance, we just saw a massive increase in output in manufactured goods, and that also became associated with material and economic prosperity in Great Britain. And then other countries obviously wanted to follow suit, right? We saw other European countries industrializing right after. The US also came after, and around by the start of the 1900s, I'd say it became kind of a well-known or a stylized fact that economic development, that economic might, that national economic prosperity happened through building up manufacturing capabilities. That's how productivity growth happened. That's how job growth happened. That's also how you got a competitive advantage in terms of trade with other nations, right? Manufactured goods are the most traded good in the world today. So that's kind of a brief history of industrialization and why industrialization has become so important and basically synonymous with economic development, productivity growth, technological advancement, and national economic power, if you will.
Now, how does that intersect with dominant narratives around free trade and how, especially economists from the global north, often tell countries from the global south how they should go about constructing their economic policies?
I think we then need to move a little bit a little bit towards the role of the state in economic development and the role of the state in industrialization and industrial policy, right? So when we talk about building up manufacturing capabilities, when we talk about industrialization, we talk about normally a structural transformation of the economy. So uh, it is about seeing some kind of change in how things are produced within a country. It's about seeing the economy move from, for example, being producing or exporting primary resources, commodities, towards more advanced goods. And there's been a debate for a long time as to how this structural transformation occurs, right? Do you need state intervention to make it happen? Or can you kind of let market forces be unleashed, right? Can you let this happen gradually through, for example, opening up to trade? And this is where this debate on free trade comes in, because historically we've seen that countries that build up manufacturing capabilities and economic prosperity over time have been quite dependent on trading with other nations. However, and in defense of those who say that the state is very important here and that the state needs to intervene in markets, you've had heavy industrial policy in essentially all countries that have successfully embarked on this kind of transformation, right? So because we're talking about a transformation of the economy, we're also at the core talking about these state versus free market debates.
And you brought up in your book a case study situating China versus Mexico. Could you go into that case study and explain then the prior point about how the state plays and then how does um, kind of foreign free trade like enter that conversation?
Sure. I mean, there are tons of examples we can draw on beyond just China and Mexico. So in my book, I have a case study on Mexico to show the pitfalls of trade liberalization without an active state that controls where that is headed. And we saw in Mexico, that was a country that in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s and 70s built up quite decent manufacturing capabilities, and then liberalized quite heavily and especially attracted foreign investors from the United States to set up operations in Mexico, and a lot of the manufacturing operations. Now, why wasn't this unambiguously good for Mexico? Well, what happened over time is that the operations of these companies became very footloose. They essentially did what they wanted in Mexico. They didn't focus very much on spillovers, technological spillovers. They didn't focus very much on training the local workforce in skilled professions. So eventually, when China entered the stage and had a cost advantage over Mexico in terms of labor costs, these US companies could easily move elsewhere. Now, had we seen a more active state and a state that had a more clear industrial policy in Mexico at that time in the 90s, in some ways going against going against the principles of free trade, you could have potentially seen more stronger and more advanced industrial capabilities being built up in Mexico. So these examples we've seen all over the world where trade liberalization, attraction of foreign direct investment, and attraction of multinational corporations from the perspective of a developing country doesn't really yield much more than short-term benefits like export earnings and some creation of jobs, but often set up footloose operations, sometimes not really yielding productivity growth for the economy as a whole. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, often East Asian economies, but particularly also China, which has done the opposite. They also attracted foreign investments from the United States, that became especially heavy in the late 90s, the early 2000s, and increasing from then on, and that's still going on. But those China strategically utilized those investments to build up productive capabilities, right? The state had strong ownership in the economy. It still has through state-owned enterprises. The state focused a lot on local content requirements for foreign investors that came in. The state focused a lot on joint venture agreements between Chinese companies and foreign companies. And that really helped the Chinese build up strong manufacturing and productive capabilities, not only in sort of low tech sectors, but also in high tech sectors, right? So here you see two diverging stories, two countries that liberalized trade, two countries that focused a lot on attracting capital from higher income countries, but achieved quite different results. Because in the one instance, there was a more strategic industrial policy in place compared to the other instance.
Fascinating. Is there another case study that's of particular interest to you that elucidates some of these points?
I've written quite extensively about the East Asian developmental states. So when I talk about the East Asian developmental states, I primarily think of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And I think Korea is very, very fascinating in this respect. This is a country that industrialized at breakneck speed from 1960 to 1990 and used a lot of the same policies that I've alluded to in China's case, right? State ownership in the economy. Korea also were heavy users of trade policy, tariffs, subsidies, etc. So in East Asia more broadly, you see generally more successful industrial policy. It's and then you also have many cases of trade liberalization that hasn't been as successful more broadly across the African continent. We also saw that trade liberalization, or rather dismantling of state intervention in the 80s, being quite disastrous for economic growth there. Generally when we talk about industrial policy here, and now I'm mentioning many cases of successful industrial policy and some cases of failed industrial policy. And you might ask yourself, okay, what's the key ingredient here to being successful with industrial policy? And some of it has to do with the things that I said. And there is unfortunately no blueprint. There's nothing that I can say that this is the key to getting everything right. And if you do this, then you'll get it right because it depends on domestic factors, geopolitical context, and so on. But there's one point I think which is important to make, which is that industrial policy can fail. It will fail in the future. It has failed in the past. But without any element of industrial policy, failure is a certainty. That is to say, you really need state intervention, although it can fail, but you really need it if you want to succeed in the long run with economic development.
Yes, in a way you can't build muscle unless you go to the gym. You might hurt yourself at the gym, but there's no other way of getting around that fact.
I think
Regard
that's a great analogy.
Yeah, yeah. Regarding the South Korean example, just a note I made from the book. Um, you talk here about the example of the South Korean steel company POSCO as a great example. Set up in 1968 as a state-owned enterprise, POSCO was ridiculed by the World Bank when it was first introduced because South Korea had no capabilities in steel production in the 1960s. It was clearly an incredibly risky venture. Today, POSCO is the fourth largest steel producer in the world. The example of POSCO goes to show that industrial policy needs to avoid and circumvent transnational capital in addition to linking it up in order to be truly successful. So that gives, I think, listeners a little window into that particular example with South Korea, just to show where they started, where they ended up, what were the outside forces telling them. And so, if you wouldn't mind zooming in on that example and explaining more your points there about avoiding and circumventing transnational capital, and then going back to your prior point about the role of state-owned enterprises.
Yeah. Well, let me just start with state-owned enterprises because that's a shorter point, and I'd like to expand a bit on this whole idea of circumventing transnational capital versus linking up to transnational capital. I mentioned how China has used state-owned enterprises as a key tool in its industrial policy. Actually, China is the prime example. I think there is something like between 300,000 and 2 million state-owned enterprises in China. That's by far the biggest in the world. And actually, if you look at the fastest growing economies, the fastest growing developing countries in the world right now, you see a clear trend that most of them rely heavily on state-owned enterprises. Vietnam is a great example. Brazil is a great example. Now, Korea was one of the first ones, and I think POSCO is so interesting because POSCO is today one of the largest private steel companies in the world and started as a state-owned enterprise. And you mentioned this thing about linking up to transnational capital versus circumventing transnational capital. In some ways here, it's about it's about conforming to comparative advantage, doing what you're good at, and conforming a bit to the principles also of free trade, attracting what wants to come, attracting to your country what the market dictates, versus going against what the market dictates, defying comparative advantage. This has been a long-standing debate in economics, going back to Adam Smith, David Ricardo, who is really famous for his theory of comparative advantage. The theory, just for those listeners who aren't familiar with it, basically says that in international trade, or countries will benefit from free international trade or increasing or participating in international trade through producing and exporting that product that they are relatively best at producing and exporting. That's the simplest way I think I can explain the idea of comparative advantage. So if you rely on what you have in your country as indicated by your labor, your land, your skills, then you should do that, rely on market forces to kind of maximize the exports of that. But if you do that, this doesn't take into account that over time, if you just rely on comparative advantage, you get stuck producing and exporting low value goods and importing high value goods. The process of economic development is a process of breaking that pattern, of breaking the pattern of being dependent on producing and exporting low value goods and going into high value goods. And history has shown us to do that, you need to defy comparative advantage. And that's what South Korea did. And that's what POSCO is such a great example of. POSCO was set up as a state-owned enterprise to produce steel. And the World Bank at the time told Korea, you have no business in producing steel. There's nothing within your endowments, your resource endowments, your labor endowments that says that you should be producing steel. You should rely on your comparative advantage. And Korea knew that, the Korean leadership knew that they needed to defy comparative advantage, be risky, go into, make some bets on sectors that were high tech at the time, and defy comparative advantage. And that's what they did, and they were successful with that. And I think in any, successful development case, you have a mix of relying on comparative advantage, relying on doing low value things, or producing and exporting things that that don't require sophisticated skills. For example, low value manufactured exports like apparel, which Korea did, also agricultural products like rice, which Korea did. You need to do those things, but you also need to have a strategy in place to do the more ambitious, sophisticated things, define comparative advantage.
And then could you perhaps touch on spillovers when states engage in industrial policy where there's a hyper focus on like the particular industry such as steel, but how does one industry beget spillovers that then kind of compounds over time to create adjacent industries or even new industries?
So there's nothing automatic about this process. Let me be clear. Sometimes you can only build capabilities that is specific to a certain process, but sometimes there are spillovers, right? For example, Huawei today doesn't only make phones, they've also developed capabilities now in producing chips, right? But on the flip side, it's not a given, say that if you're good at producing steel, you can suddenly become good at producing humanoid robots. But there's a connection between training a workforce that's in, going from agriculture to the factory floor to doing research and development and science, right? And there is a connection between that transition and also producing many more high tech things. So that's kind of what I'll say about that.
Great. And then can you return to the linking up with transnational capital point?
Sure. So I talked a bit about that in relation to the whole idea about comparative advantage. But if we talk specifically about transnational capital, what I like to say here is that in the last 100, let's say roughly 100 years, what's become clear is that in the process of development, we've seen that attracting capital from abroad has become essential for raising investment rates, has become essential for technology transfer, has become essential for creating jobs, and so on, right? So, for example, in China today, Vietnam today, and also in Korea, right, we saw that capital from wealthier nations was attracted to try to achieve all these things. In the apparel industry in Korea, Nike was the global apparel company Nike was extremely important. At one point, I believe Korea made around 80% of Nike's apparel products. So clearly, multinational capital was important. But if we think about big companies in Korea today, we think about Korean companies, you know, like Hyundai, for example. So this is to say that you need this transnational capital, you need these multinational corporations to come in, because that can be beneficial, again, for technology transfer, for job creation, for investment, for exports. But you also need a strategy to create domestic champions, domestic companies.
Got it. And while the point's still fresh in my head, for listeners that are familiar with my examinations of Ireland, going back to the comparative advantage point, a long problem in Irish history had been the enforcement of a theory that Ireland's comparative advantage was always sort of stuck in agriculture, the cattle trade, and the irony of that is one, the naturalness of the comparative advantage of the cattle trade in Ireland and exclusiveness to agriculture uh, was an artificial imposition by the British, who actually expanded the cattle trade in Ireland and moved uh, the mode of farming from tillage to cattle, basically coming out of the 17th century. And so this was like an artificial imposition of an overseer class. And so by the time you fast forward into the 19th century of the era of industrialization, and then into the 20th century when Ireland gains its independence, the notion of comparative advantage treats Ireland's agricultural fixation as a natural state of life, rather than one, looking at the historical artificialness of it, and two, looking at it as our guest here has spoken to, that you have to break with that, even if it is there out of historical contingency. The productive way to develop is to break with that and go against that grain. So yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out to my longtime Irish listeners to connect those dots between these ideas. So great. So we've explored history a bit. So now we're arriving more at the present. So now we have the factory of the present, and I think it would be a good time for you to define what is your factory of the future.
Um, well, this whole idea of naming my book "The Future of the Factory," in a sense, here it could also be named the future of factory-based production or the future of industrialization. So let me speak a bit more broadly about that, what production will look like in the future, specifically manufacturing production. One thing I, s- I think we see clearly is that manufacturing still matters a lot. I have a chapter in my book that talks about the rise of services and the rise of the service economy. We've seen in the past few decades that this is a trend that started as early as the 1950s, I'd say, that manufacturing as share of the global economy has, or manufacturing as share of the economy in many places in the world has gone down, and the share of services has gone up, which has fueled arguments for some time that services are much more important for development. But I want to push back a bit against this. We are seeing empirically, if we want to talk about a few cases, what's happening right now between the US and China is in many ways a battle about building and rebuilding manufacturing. China has shown us that you can still build up tremendous economic might by relying on manufacturing capabilities. And the US is now, since about 2016, has tried to implement industrial policy to revive some US manufacturing, both for creating jobs. I'm not sure how successful the US is going to be in bringing back manufacturing jobs, but certainly capabilities, it might be successful, realizing that, for example, being too dependent on importing chips is not aligned with national security goals, and that they want to make these things at home. So what we're seeing play out right now in the global economy, especially between the US and China, reiterates to us that manufacturing is extremely important for economic prosperity. Now, this is not to say that manufacturing is going to look the same or factories are going to look the same as they did before. Today, we have companies that are huge firms that make things, but that don't actually make things. What do I mean by that? For example, Apple, the company, makes the iPhone, but Apple doesn't have any factories. They outsource everything. The entire supply chain goes through East Asia and also some companies in the US. But yet, it's a manufacturing company in some ways. Apple does important research and development, industrial design, and obviously has great market power, which allows it to retain profits. So these supply chains are becoming much more complicated. You're also seeing that building up industrial design, building up R&D capabilities is becoming more important for adding value in manufacturing value chains. And yeah, and this is obviously also where power dynamics come in.
Got it. Yeah, there was an interesting stat you referenced in your book regarding Apple. Um, you say here of the final retail price of an iPhone, 1.5% goes to the most labor-intensive part of the production stage, assembly, most carried out in China. In other words, the workers who actually make the world's most popular phone pocket almost none of the profits from the sales. Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. I Yeah. So this alludes a little bit to what I was talking about in the latter part of my recent reply to your question, which is about the global dynamics at play here, right? So why does Apple take home more than 50% of the final retail price of the iPhone without actually making any of the components? Now, part of this is part of this is due to important technological capabilities that Apple has, such as industrial design capabilities, research and development capabilities. And in what I'm trying to say here is that based on the fact that Apple has these capabilities in-house, they deserve obviously to take home some of the final retail price. And also, I guess, intellectual property. But intellectual property, and I'm also going to touch upon market power here, is a big part of this story. Apple takes home more than 50% of the retail price. The people and the firms who assemble the phone, which up until now has been in China, get less than 1.5% of the retail price. Is that fair? I wouldn't say that's fair. The reason Apple can do this is because they have tremendous market power in the market for smartphones. And this is also aided by international trade agreements that protect the intellectual property of companies like Apple much more. For those of you who follow me on social media, you might have seen me say that I think we need to be much more lax with intellectual property protection, because if we do that, technology transfer can be more easily, or technology can be more easily shared across borders, which would be essential for economic development in the global south. But the system that exists now, the system that's in place now, the system of global governance, for example, as exemplified through WTO rules, makes sure that intellectual property of powerful transnational corporations is strongly protected. And these transnational corporations are mainly concentrated in the United States. So protecting intellectual property would be fine if, the filing of patents and if this intellectual property was shared equally worldwide, but it isn't. It's up until recently strongly concentrated in the United States, right? And the system of global trade rules has reinforced this protection of intellectual property. And what's happening now is very interesting to see, because the United States has been a strong defender of the WTO and the WTO rules and that rules-based order up until it stopped working for them. The WTO was supposed to work, for free trade. In some ways, ironically, because protection of intellectual property isn't really free trade. That's, about intervening in markets. But you now saw other countries starting to compete with the United States. And suddenly these WTO rules wasn't working for the United States. So now they're trying to break this rules-based order.
And then how how do these transnational corporations play into I'll say the dominant narrative of at least the U.S. administration now is that um, other whatever problem might exist inside the United States, the problem is that other countries ripped us off. Whereas these transnational corporations might have more of a role. Could you maybe go into that a little bit more and explaining how even problems in the United States themselves could be a result of this power imbalance?
Yeah. Um, this, in the I talked about how in Apple's supply chain, workers in China get a small share of the pie. We can sort of extrapolate. Well, we can extrapolate a bit and look at more broadly the system, the economic system in the United States and how that's been set up. And what we've seen in the past few decades is a system that largely benefits benefits the owners and shareholders of corporations and does not benefit workers. We've seen increasing economic inequality because of this. We've seen declining real wages, especially among the bottom 50% in the United States because of this. So this system of protecting the interests of big corporations, the shareholders of those corporations, clearly hasn't worked for most people in the United States either. And that's also why we've seen, political movements on the left gaining huge traction by criticizing this system. For example, Elizabeth Warren, right? We've seen there are huge people-powered movements that now work to have stronger antitrust legislation, so to break up powerful monopolies in the United States, to get corporate lobbying away from politics, and in China, as I mentioned, we've seen how arguably workers get fucked over, so to speak, by this system. In the United States, you might not, you see it at, I'll get back to manufacturing, but I think especially you see it in the pharmaceutical industry, where drug prices are enormously expensive and you find the same drugs in other countries for a fraction of the price. What does this tell you? It tells you that something's wrong with the pricing system and how certain companies in the pharmaceutical industry have tremendous power. Now, in the manufacturing sector in the United States, some people say that there has been a decline in manufacturing in the United States because of globalization and because of offshoring, and to some degree, this is true that jobs have been lost overseas. But the jobs that can be done in the United States now are not necessarily the same jobs that are being done in East Asia or Southeast Asia for a much, much lower wage. What has been lacking in the United States is a clear vision of industrial policy that tries to build up manufacturing capabilities, not necessarily the same manufacturing capabilities that were lost, but more broadly a manufacturing ecosystem, and also labor market policy to try and manage this restructuring of the economy that inevitably happens over time, right? Any economy goes through restructuring, goes from one type of manufacturing to different to services, and a government that looks out for its people or a state that looks out for its people has a type of industrial policy that tries to find ways to make this restructuring as least painful as possible for its workers. And that's something, so labor market policy and industrial policy, if those things were more strongly in place in the United States, you wouldn't see as much pain in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, and so it's just to connect these dots between the point about, for instance, Chinese workers getting the raw end of the deal in the manufacturing of the iPhone due to, as you say, the intellectual property protections that have been artificially enforced by the United States, even though there's some churning of that today. Um, and connecting that dot to how the problems that many in America face that have stimulated, for better or worse, criticisms of how the system operates, which could unfortunately um, go down a direction where it creates these kind of false narratives. Again, like I said, of these other countries are ripping us off. Um, so just to connect those dots, that it's at the root of both these problems are is this inordinate amount of transnational corporation power, um, and that really, when exploring ways to solve both issues, it's a challenge to that transnational corporate power. Yeah, so to move on from that, checking the time here. Okay, we're good. Um, yeah, so now we're in the present. We're talking about current challenges. Uh, how does China's rise and intersection with the current administration of the U.S. which has produced this trade war dynamic that has actually expanded way over China into the EU, for instance, in the US and other countries in the US. So, how does your book intersect into this current day trend of the trade war?
Well, my book talks about global shifts in the economy that change industrialization. It talks about the changing nature of globalization. It talks about green industrial policy, and on both these topics, China is extremely important. In my book, I say that, my book is the subtitle of my book is How Megatrends Are Changing Industrialization. And I say in the conclusion that maybe China should have been a mega trend in itself, or the rise of China. And in retrospect, it definitely should have. I would go as far as to say that the rise of China is the most significant economic and political event so far in the 21st century. And I don't think that's even if you disagree with that, I don't think it's a massive exaggeration to say that. But there have been things happening right now that my book doesn't address, things that have been happening just in the past few months. An accelerating trade war between the US and China, intensifying trade war. These tensions happened. If we, let's talk a little bit about the origin of the economic rivalry between the United States and China. I'd like to start roughly in 2017, 2018, when the first Trump administration started implementing protectionist measures and tariffs against China to try and become less dependent on Chinese product, and also because they saw China increasingly as an economic rival. And then Joe Biden's administration continued in many ways with these protectionist measures against China. Tariffs, for example, on imported renewables products like EVs, solar panels, export restriction on advanced chips specifically to China. Those are things we saw in the Biden administration, and now during the Trump administration, he's increased tariffs tremendously on China. They've come down, but now he's threatening to take those up. We don't know exactly where things are developing, but we do know that the trade relationship between these two countries is tense. We do know that Trump is trying to reduce dependency on China, and we don't know exactly his whole economic rationale behind the tariffs, because, to be honest, sometimes it looks like there isn't much of an economic rationale. But he's certainly trying to reduce the trade deficit with China. I think he's going to struggle, and we've seen that he's struggled. We've seen that China has the upper hand here in this trade war with the US. Why is this? The reason is pretty simple. The US is more dependent on Chinese imported goods than China is on exports to the US. China has successfully diversified the destinations for its exports in the last 5 years or so. This is data that I've shared on social media as we've seen this trade war go along. They prepared for this moment. They saw it coming when Trump came into office. They probably suspected that he would raise tariffs. And so China loses a little bit of its export market. It hurts both economies, but now also Trump is actually realizing that that he's hurting the American economy by applying these tariffs onto China. Why is he hurting the American economy? Well, first of all, consumers have become highly dependent, and they've actually benefited from importing finished goods. But another important part of the story here is that over time, a lot of American companies, a lot of especially big transnational companies, for example, Apple and Nvidia, right? They become dependent on Chinese imported goods and also China as a market. So their supply chains are very much integrated into China. And when he raised his tariffs on Liberation Day, a lot of the CEOs of these big tech companies came to Trump and said, what are you doing? You can't be serious. This is going to crush us. China is an extremely important partner for us. They provide many important inputs into our supply chains. They're also becoming an increasingly important end market for our goods, etc. So, what's going to happen next between the U.S. and China? We'll see. I don't think Trump is going to be able to keep these tariffs up or at least raise them again. The economic interdependence between these two countries is extremely strong. And for those US based listeners who think that China has been ripping off the US, I'd say that the US has probably benefited more than China has. China has surely benefited from investments in the US and access to the US market, but which country has workers that's been toiling on the factory floor for people in the other country? It's China. It's in China where we've seen factory workers toiling to assemble iPhones for consumers in America. So how is that not Americans ripping off the Chinese? You tell me.
Yeah, it's quite the conundrum for people to try to explain around that. I'll also add, for anyone that would perhaps like look at the growth of U.S. GDP overlaid over U.S. wages and its relative stagnant growth. The that point again of connecting the dots between um, the Chinese workers getting ripped off themselves, but again, American workers also getting ripped off. That benefit is disproportionately going towards these transnational corporations, the very, very wealthy. And so when you look at a chart like GDP growth versus wage growth, you can actually see it's like, okay, well, all of this free trade, globalization, so forth, um, benefits that while that is certainly in place for consumer prices for everyday Americans, um, a lot of that benefit disproportionately went to the very wealthy of America. So yeah,
That's
if you wanted to add to that, go
yeah,
for it.
that's just I think the point you're making is extremely important, especially for the American listeners. China is not your enemy. China is not causing immiseration in the United States. What you need in the United States is a system that more clearly takes care of workers, that more clearly takes care of the middle class. You see this very clearly when you look at trends in the US, as you say, how GDP has developing compared to real wages for the middle class. It's quite shocking, right? You need, in many ways, America is impressive with, they're at the forefront of innovation in many ways, in Silicon Valley, etc. American companies are always, at the in this discussion when we talk about cutting edge technologies. But where America falls short is actually creating a system that benefits the middle class, and especially the lower end of that middle class. And that's where again, industrial policy and labor market policy and redistributive policies come in. And that's where I hope people put their anger towards about a politics that that fights for more equality rather than blaming China, because that is not going to get you very far.
Could you speak to how perhaps as well what might seem disconnected, which is having those labor protections or like a worker-centered approach to governance, how that actually corrodes the innovation that we then say that's the trade-off for the Americans having a system like that. Does in fact the inability to protect your workers and supply a lot of people in your society with a sustainable lifestyle, um, does that actually erode the ability for your system to produce innovation? Because then, especially with the caveat that it seems like a lot of U.S. innovation is genesis in a period of American sort of 1940 to 1970s-ish uh, system that was actually more worker centered. So can you speak to that, please?
Yeah. Well, that's also, um, where does who should be credited for innovation in America? Let's start there, right? There are a lot of factors at play here. We can talk about amazing entrepreneurs. We can talk about the innovation system. And in fact, there used to be a pretty impressive innovation system in America. And to some degree, there still is a state-funded innovation system, especially in relation to military-related spending. There is a brilliant book called The Entrepreneurial State, written by Mariana Mazzucato, that talks about how almost all the technologies feeding into the iPhone comes from defense-related spending in the United States, especially DARPA. So to some extent, that busts this myth that all the innovation in the United States comes from the private sector. But let's talk about the people behind innovation in the United States. I mentioned amazing entrepreneurs, but where do the people who work in Silicon Valley actually come from? A lot of them come from India, and a lot of them come from China. So in many ways, you could argue that it's people from other countries that are the backbone of the American innovation system, right? Which Donald Trump is now on the verge of ruining due to this latest stunt of trying to expel all international students from China. So so yeah, I think we really need to question these conventional ideas about innovation primarily or only being a part of these amazing entrepreneurs, amazing individual entrepreneurs.
Yeah. That is vitally important to highlight. I think one of the things that I was trying to get at was idea of that post-war American experience of trying to raise up the middle class and then having policies in place that nurtured that and then allowed the economy to sort of gain from a well distribution of benefits actually enabled people from middle class, from the working class, so forth, to actually engage in the economy and actually, through that dispersed effect, create a lot of the innovation and the growth of that era of American economics. Whereas today, the hollowing out of that, the sort of the limitations placed, and in a way, the stagnancy of the upper 10%, upper 1%, that creates a function in which you actually like don't have the actual meritocracy because you're not putting in place policies to stimulate the social mobility from the working, middle, or so forth class. So I think that's sort of where it gets to a problem um, with American conceptions of their innovation system, where like they think it's about kind of these individualized success stories, and it's like sort of a gamble when it's a much more systematic policy approach that undergirds everything. That's
Yeah.
what I was trying to say. Yeah,
Yeah, let's get back to that point now.
sure.
And I went on a bit of a tangent as it relates to innovation, an important one. But let's get back to this now, the relationship uh, between good jobs and innovation. And we could probably talk at length about examples of worker-owned companies that are tremendously successful. We're seeing the emergence of a lot of those models in China, where workers have a big say in how the company is run. We have examples of amazing companies also in Europe. Gross supermarket cooperatives are very common in Europe. In the US, you have this amazing uh, outdoors company called REI, which is a worker cooperative. But when we talk about really successful companies, we need to ask ourselves, what is the metric of success? Is it global market share? Is it just the creation of jobs? Okay, let's look at the FAANG companies, these big companies in the US like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Tesla, etc. What is it that make these great companies? If they achieve these tremendous global market shares, how does that really benefit America if the people who work for those companies don't really, have good contracts or good hours or good labor standards or generally in the economy? And this is something that I think has gotten lost a bit in the West, but especially in America, that the metrics of success is, profit, market shares, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, these things are not unimportant, but at the root, you need to look at how, if people are well off, right? If people are happy in their jobs, they're well paid, if people generally have access to, the services that they need in the economy, that's what makes a solid economy. And to some degree, that's, I think, been lost in this idea of a prosperous economy in America.
Yeah, as just sort of an antidote, I think it's becoming commonplace in America to identify something as like being having the private equity effect. So this is when more like traditional businesses that maybe do plumbing or housework or things like that, they've been more and more gobbled up by these private equity firms and kind of rolled into these sort of portfolios, and then the top-down private equity managers sort of dictate what the new policies are. What ends up happening is, like you're saying, there's a success metric the private equity guys are working with that may,
Yeah.
show number go up, but every customer has the same experience where they realize the quality has gone down, the prices have gone up, and it seems like this is more an instance of like kind of rentier like market capture and
Mhm.
monopolization of something rather than these success metrics that are being used in the finance world actually having a meaningful relation to how people perceive real value in the economy.
I mean, talking about success, there's something I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. So I've lived in America. I have a lot of American friends. In many ways, I I like American culture, but there are also things about American culture that I question. And one is what is success? And I think here, coming from a European country, we think about success in many different ways. But my interpretation of how that's perceived in America is a bit different, having lived there and knowing a lot of people from there, where success is seen primarily. If you are successful as an individual, it means making money, correct?
Yes, that is the
Yes, means
American
making money,
metric.
right? And to some degree, this belief that you're successful if you make money, I guess, drives an entrepreneurial spirit and so on. And we see that spirit alive and well in America, and it's impressive in many ways. But it's also dangerous uh, when that becomes the sole idea of success.
Yeah, there definitely is, and I think this has to do as well a little bit with the culture prioritizing the tech startup entrepreneur as like a cultural icon in
Mm,
comparison to, I mean, what I would imagine like America always had this cultural dynamic, but I think you had more of a cultural consensus on the factory owner of a small town in Ohio, that retained jobs for the community. I think that was a prior era of American definition of success. There was in a sense like noblesse oblige to how the wealthy of America. I don't want to, whitewash anything here, but I'm just saying like for like I said, this factory owner in Ohio that supports jobs for a small town, and he keeps the factory there to support the jobs, and he invests in the town and so forth. I think that was much more of a fixed cultural position in America, whereas today it's this very atomized, individualized tech startup entrepreneur that is disconnected from all that, and it's like they don't employ people really. It's a very small company, and it's just like this very closed off drive to sort of how can I create a narrative to get venture capitalists to invest in me, even though I make no money. So there's an element of hyperbole that is now baked into American views of how you get success. You have to be hyperbolic, and so you have to essentially, I'll polemically say you have to embrace the tactics of a snake oil salesman
Yeah.
to just get through the door to get the investment in you. And then at a certain point, like, okay, you're driving to then maybe get profitability, but more the case, you want to get to an IPO to become a public company. And at that point, you're just figuring out how do you grow fast enough and big enough that you can do that, and everything else is exploitable for you. So I think it's one, this is a historic cultural dynamic of America that, of course, have been individualistic, that has been more, you could say, risk-taking or capitalistic. That's all these conversations have been had. But I think there's this very weird newer dynamic of shifting into this tech startup model of culture, and I think that does a lot of more damage to how people perceive success in their everyday lives today. I mean, and that compounds, of course. Funny enough, I forgot to mention the cultural emphasis of like the prior Wall Street guys and how they view economics and hollowing out things. So I think like that so while, like I said, the historic trend has been known in America, these newer models have compounded that, and I think have made things a lot worse.
You have to, I won't forget that, what you just said. You have to embrace the role of a snake oil salesman to be a success.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I spent a lot of my 20s working around tech startups, and while like I hate to paint with broad brushes, but while there's many good, and this is of course a necessary section of like how innovation works, how new companies are formed, and so forth. Maybe there's other ways to do it, but while there's good being done, there is a lot of bad that goes into it. I mean, we just know from statistics, 9 out of 10 venture capital funded startups fail. And so right off the bat, like this is just the consensus agreed upon statistics that goes on to justify you need one of those 10 bets to make enough money to pay for everything and get a profit out of it.
Mm,
And so right off the bat, like you're kind of in a position where 9 of the 10 companies are giving you bullshit potentially. Now, maybe they just failed and they did a good try, wasn't the right time, wasn't the right market fit, and they failed and they had a good effort. But the more and more that I've seen happen as we now drifted into the 2020s is that these tech startups have kind of lost sight of like trying to actually like be companies, and it's all about how do I build myself into a narrative to get the VC funding, to then keep getting VC funding, to then IPO, and then kind of continue down this route. I mean, we've actually seen a huge clog in private big tech startups in their ability to IPO because there's a lot of questions on if they're as valuable as they are saying they are, and if they actually do IPO, their value is going to crash. So this is like a huge kind of problem that's emerged. And one of the things that I've noticed as well is that there used to be a lot of emphasis in the 2000s and the 2010s on actually like thinking about business model, about thinking about talk to your customers, constantly engage with your customers, build apps around that, and think about like, obviously you're getting investment before you reach profitability, but like profitability, getting revenue, like those were much more important factors. And now we've just a lot of people have been more and more dismissive of that type of methodology and has just gone down this road of you fake it till you make it. All you need is VC. You don't need revenue. You don't have to engage with your customers. And the most shocking and disappointing trend I've seen in the tech world has been the ingratiation of Silicon Valley um, into more and more sort of looking at the Department of Defense as their like bailout of last resort. I've seen a lot more companies sort of start to gravitate. And while like we can go to the Mazzucato history book, and of course like look at the role of the Defense Department and so forth of investing and shaping Silicon Valley. But I think that's a very different thing back then than what's kind of going on today, which is just like trying to, create weapons of war or adjacent technologies for war, and then trying to just like parasite off of the bloated DoD budget. So it's a very it's been a very weird history to watch the tech world of America evolve, and that's where getting back to it, a lot of it seems to be kind of morphing into this like snake oil salesman stuff.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing those insights.
Yeah, 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 yeah. A good journalist that kind of writes about this that I followed as of late is Ed Citron. I think he's based out of the UK, and he kind of goes into a lot of these critiques at a deeper level of the tech industry and where it's sort of spun into. But I think if we could return to your book, I think that actually like brings us maybe back into a conversation that I wanted to get into of like how modern economies have like service economies and like how we positioned ourselves into these new technologies, which includes these startups, especially like how AI is becoming the dominant genre of tech. Um, and I was hoping you could speak to um, how we should go into the future thinking about services and manufacturing, and with these trends of AI and automation coming at us.
Hmm. Well, let's talk first about the first one. Um, I think what you want to create a prosperous economy, whether you're low income, middle income, or high income, is to build up high value productive capabilities, right? And here defining high value as the value you get in the market. Advanced technological capabilities, whether that's in manufacturing or in services, doesn't doesn't matter. But it turns out that a lot of it is in manufacturing or in manufacturing ecosystems. What I mean when I say manufacturing ecosystems, I mean things that have, engineers who are involved in somehow producing a good, but could be doing what is classified as a service, like again, testing or design or research and development. These are services that the US actually have a lot of, but they're counted as services and not manufacturing. So building up high tech, high value capabilities domestically, it's what will drive the strength of an economy. And I say, regardless of which sector that is in, with the caveat of saying a lot more is in manufacturing than what people tend to think. Because some people view manufacturing as something you do when you develop or something you did in the last century. Still, it's very important, right? What's the most critical industry today? It's the semiconductor industry, and that's a manufacturing industry. This is really what it's about. That's not about. I'm not disregarding the importance here of lots of services, but you need high value, high tech activities in both manufacturing and services, and you need a strong traded sector as well, normally to be a strong and prosperous economy, and then you need manufacturing. Yeah, should we open this can of worms of automation too, and AI? Well, I mean, AI is part of the whole thing I just mentioned, right? And the US seems to be doing great, and but also many other, both China and the US seems to be doing well in terms of leading the race in AI related technology. But uh, a big debate here is whether or not this new technology, especially AI related automation, will make it impossible to create or maintain jobs in the economy as a whole. I have a chapter in my book devoted to this. I'll give you the very short spiel now, which is that we shouldn't worry too much about the job displacing effect of automation related technology. We will see some restructuring because of it. We've seen some sectors being disrupted because of it. But for various reasons, AI does not cause large scale job display, or AI or digital related automation just does not create large scale job displacement. One is that there is a productivity enhancing effect of introducing these new technologies, which creates jobs. There is also a direct effect whereby the introduction of new technology creates demand for new jobs. And there's also the fact that AI related automation technologies are, on the whole, unable to replace jobs, but rather tasks within jobs. And that's why most of the really serious and detailed forecast studies do not forecast large scale job losses. They forecast restructuring actually with net gains in jobs. A recent study by the OECD found that in those countries that have implemented digital automation technologies in the 2010s have experienced larger job growth than those countries that have not. If we look at China, a country where industrial robots have been introduced on a massive scale, we see even within companies that have introduced these robots, such as BYD, create tens of thousands of jobs due to the effects that I mentioned now. And let me say, this does not mean that we won't have disruption in some sectors. And things could look very different 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? It's difficult to have a crystal ball and see in the future. Another really important point when we talk about digitalization and AI is that there's a lot of hype around these technologies, but we need to remember that the scale up and the commercialization of these technologies happens mainly in wealthier nations. In many poorer nations, in many manufacturing most manufacturing companies in sub-Saharan Africa, they still use more analog than digital technologies. I don't think many people know that. So we also need to understand that we hear about this a lot in Western English language press, and you also see the roll-up of some of these technologies in East Asia, but in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa and in parts of South America, you haven't really seen the commercialization of these technologies in the workplace at large, other than, of course, these chatbots like ChatGPT, etc.
Yeah, is there a way in which the systems that a particular country might implement also shapes the way automation is rolled out? So for instance, does the automation trends in China look differently than those in America or another global north country?
To some degree, yes. To some degree, no. We have seen more automation in China being implemented in the manufacturing system, whereas you've seen more automation in wealthier nations occur more in service sectors. But I also would say that China is a very unique case. China is a unique case in almost every way. But China, I would say, is still a developing country in many ways, but in some sectors embrace the characteristics of a high-income country.
Got it.
Peter, I should say that I am running out of time.
Sure. So let's start to wrap up. I appreciate that. So yeah, so I want to get to sort of Your conclusion of the factory in the future, um, what is the main takeaway you want readers to come from your book?
So there are two key messages um, I try to emphasize in the book. One is that manufacturing still matters a lot for creating economic prosperity in nations of all levels of income. And we're seeing shifts such as the rise of services and the rise of automation that are important and in some ways challenge that, but less than what people think. Another key takeaway is that power asymmetries in the world economy really dictate these days who benefits from building industrialization and to what degree, right? We've talked about, the case of Apple, for example, seeing how that some countries can be inserted into their supply chains, but not necessarily reap the benefits that they deserve. So with this globalization of production, we're seeing that the distribution of value in global value chains and global supply chains is highly uneven, and we need to change global governance structures to change that. We need to try to do that at least. So those are the two takeaways of my book.
Great. Well, I encourage all of the listeners to go to the info section below. I'll have a link to the book, and you can find it on Google, Amazon. Go for it. Any other links I'll provide as well to your other writing or to keep updates on you. Is there any particular projects or things to tell people where to go that you would like to share?
In terms of the projects that I'm working on,
Yeah, just sort of a final, this is what your next book is, or this is
oh
what
yeah,
you're researching right now that you'd like just to give a hint on.
yeah, I'm doing a lot of research right now on green industrial policies. So if you're interested in that topic, do follow, what I put out there in the near future. And also another stream on geopolitics and this emergence of the new economic nationalism that we're seeing across a range of countries and what that means for global prosperity. And I have a couple of book projects that I'm thinking about, but I have to decide which one to pursue. So I'm going to keep that a secret for a little bit longer. But there is a book in the making.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure that will be interesting for the listeners to follow up on. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate your time very much so. And yeah, excited for myself to follow your work and read what you have in the future. So thank you for your time, and thanks for listening, everyone.